My wife goes on vacations, posts photos from sushi restaurants, and her mother sends me texts. A real man works 2 jobs. I'm already working. I'm a father. But it seems that this is not enough. We broke up before our son was born, long before the hospital bags were packed or the crib was assembled. But despite the heartache and the silence that had begun to define our relationship, we agreed, without much discussion, that we would live together for a few months after the birth. Not for each other but for him. I took the couch, she stayed in the bedroom, and we cleared out the small home office to make space for a nursery, complete with soft curtains, a changing table, and a mobile that played quiet lullabies when the room was still. The setup was functional, not ideal, and the air between us was thick with everything we weren't saying, but there was also a quiet understanding that, for now, this was how it had to be. It was tense in ways I can't fully describe, like living with a stranger who knows all your soft spots. We moved around each other like ghosts, carefully avoiding old wounds while trying to pretend we were just parents now, not 2 people who had once tried and failed to be something more. But at night, when the baby cried and we both stumbled toward the sound half asleep, something shifted. For a few minutes at a time, we weren't exes. We weren't broken. We were just 2 exhausted people trying to keep a tiny life safe and warm. And in those moments, even through all the hurt, I knew why we stayed. After Jack was born, there was a brief stretch of time, maybe 2 weeks at most, when we both tried to be civilized, holding on to this fragile sense of partnership for the sake of the tiny, wrinkled human now sleeping between feedings in the nursery. We passed each other bottles, shared the midnight shifts, even managed a few conversations that didn't carry the sharp edges of our breakup. But it didn't last. Slowly, almost predictably, the distance returned. We began avoiding each other again, slipping back into old patterns where the only words exchanged were about diapers, feeding schedules, or the pediatrician's next appointment. The tension was no longer hidden. It sat in the space between us like a permanent fixture in the living room. Even our silences changed, less heavy with sadness, more filled with quiet resignation. I would come home from work and head straight to Jack's room, bypassing any interaction unless it was strictly necessary. She did the same. And I think we both knew without needing to say it out loud that this wasn't sustainable. It wasn't just hard, it was impossible. Whatever threads had held us together in the first few days of parenthood had already frayed, and the truth was clear. We couldn't live under the same roof anymore. Not without sacrificing whatever small amount of peace we still had left to give to our son. We officially divorced before Jack's first birthday, quietly signing the papers at a courthouse that felt too cold and too impersonal for what it marked. The end of something we had once tried to build, and the beginning of something new, more complicated, and defined only by our shared responsibility to a little boy who hadn't asked for any of this. There were no fights over custody, no dramatic courtroom scenes, just a mutual understanding that this was what needed to happen. I agreed to pay $600 a month in child support, not because anyone forced me to, but because it felt fair, and because I knew that, at least in the beginning, I wouldn't be there much. At the time, my job swallowed me whole. The hours were brutal, the pressure relentless, and by the end of each week, I barely had the energy to do anything but sleep. So I settled into a pattern of seeing Jack only on weekends, trading weekday exhaustion for 2 rushed days of fatherhood where I tried to make up for my absence with trips to the park, bottles warmed in quiet kitchens, and sleepy stories read with my forehead resting against his. I told myself it was temporary, that I was doing what I had to do to provide for him, to make sure he had what he needed, even if I wasn't always there to give it in person. But every Sunday night when I handed him back, something in me twisted, not just guilt, but a deep ache that whispered I was already missing things I'd never get back. At the time I was working in sales, grinding through 10 to 12-hour days that blurred together, every one of them packed with meetings, cold calls, long drives, and the endless weight of quotas that never seemed to care whether you were burned out or barely holding it together. I didn't have a safety net to fall back on, no one to lean on when the pressure got too heavy. My parents had retired to Florida years ago, living their quiet life in the sun, and my sister had moved to Europe for work, building a life oceans away from mine. The distance wasn't just measured in miles, it was in missed calls, holidays spent apart, and the quiet reality that I was alone out here. Meanwhile, Megan lived only a few minutes from her parents and her sister, and they were present in ways I couldn't be. They helped her with Jack during the day, took turns watching him when she needed a break, and were the ones who saw his first steps, his early words, the way he smiled when someone said his name. I told myself I was glad he had that kind of support, and I truly was, but it also reminded me of how far away I felt from it all. While she had help, I had deadlines. While she had family dinners, I had takeout in the front seat of my car. And every night when I finally made it home, I would sit in the silence of my apartment and wonder how I was supposed to be a father from the outside looking in. There were so many nights when I sat alone in my apartment, staring at photos Megan had sent me or scrolling through short videos of Jack laughing or toddling across the living room, and I felt like a failure, like a bad father who was always a few steps behind his own son's life. I missed his first steps, that clumsy, miraculous wobble across the carpet that everyone talks about. I missed his first word, which Megan told me was ball, and I tried to smile when she said it, even though something in my chest cracked a little. These were the moments you're supposed to carry for the rest of your life, and I had to live them through a phone screen, always after the fact, always secondhand. But I tried. God, I tried. On the rare weekdays when the stars aligned and I finished work before the sky went completely dark, I would drive across the city just for 20 minutes in the park or a short trip to get him ice cream. I knew he wouldn't remember those moments yet, that he was too little to understand the effort behind them, but I did it anyway. I showed up with tired eyes and aching shoulders, sometimes still in my work clothes, just to hold his hand on a swing or hear his laughter echo across a quiet playground. And even when I was exhausted, even when the time felt too short, I told myself over and over that it mattered. That being there, whenever and however I could, meant something. Because I wasn't trying to be a perfect father. I was just trying not to be absent. 3 years later, something in me finally shifted, and I made the decision to leave the high-paying sales job that had been draining the life out of me, not just professionally but personally. It wasn't easy, giving up the financial stability, the commissions, the sense of success that came with those long hours, but I couldn't keep trading time with my son for a bigger paycheck. I found a new job, one that paid less but came with something I hadn't had in years: flexibility. For the first time since Jack was born, I could breathe a little. I could leave work before sunset, make plans in advance, and actually be present instead of just passing through his life like a weekend guest. As my schedule opened up, so did our time together. At first, I started seeing him more frequently, weekends turned into extended stays, and eventually we moved into a 60-40th split. It felt like progress, like I was slowly reclaiming something I'd been aching for. Megan and I managed it surprisingly well, and with time and effort we found a rhythm that worked. Before long, we reached a full 50-50 arrangement, and for the first time I truly felt like a real, consistent part of Jack's world. I rented a modest 2-room apartment, not anything fancy, but it mattered to me that Jack had his own room. I painted the walls his favorite color, set up a little bookshelf with his bedtime stories, and bought the same kind of nightlight he used at his mom's place so the transition would feel softer. I wanted him to know this wasn't just where he stayed, it was his home too. A space that was his, where he was wanted, where his drawings hung on the fridge and his laughter filled the hall. It wasn't about square footage or decor, it was about building something real between us, something that said, "You belong here, every bit as much as you do anywhere else." When I met Lauren, she lived in a neighboring town just far enough that it made seeing each other a little complicated at first, but close enough that it never felt out of reach. From the very beginning, something about her felt different. Calm, grounded, the kind of person who listens fully when you speak and never makes you feel like you're too much. We took things slow, carefully, because Jack was part of my world now in a way that shaped every decision I made. But over time, as our weekends turned into routines and she began joining us for little outings or quiet dinners, I started to see something I hadn't expected: how naturally she fit into our lives. A year later, we moved in together, choosing a place that felt like a fresh start but still close enough to keep our parenting schedule steady. I was nervous, not about us but about how Jack would adjust. I didn't want him to feel like anything was being taken away from him, like this change would suddenly split his world again. But Lauren was patient, never pushing, always finding little ways to include him, like learning the names of his favorite dinosaurs or sitting beside him during movie nights without making a big deal of it. Somewhere along the way, Jack started calling her his second adult. Not stepmom, not anything forced or rehearsed, just that simple, honest phrase that only a child could come up with. And every time I hear him say it, something quiet and full settles in my chest. It touches me more than I can explain because I know what it means. It means he feels safe. It means he feels seen. And it means that somehow, despite all the broken pieces and the hard choices, we've built something whole. We got married last year in a small ceremony that felt more like a warm gathering than a formal event, surrounded by the people who had walked with us through all the quiet, complicated chapters of our story. Jack was the ring bearer, proudly marching down the aisle in a little suit he had picked out himself, holding the pillow like it was the most important job in the world. He kept glancing over at me with that wide, toothy grin of his, and when he handed us the rings he whispered, "You're gonna be great," like he was the one giving the vows. I'll never forget that moment. It was simple and perfect and everything I had ever hoped a second chance could look like. Since then, life has found its rhythm. There's a kind of peace in our home now, the kind that comes from being seen and chosen, not just once but every day. But I won't pretend it's all easy. Financially, we're struggling. My salary is steady but modest, a trade-off I willingly made to be more present, and Lauren, despite being one of the most compassionate and dedicated teachers I've ever known, earns barely enough to cover her own classroom supplies, let alone contribute significantly to our household expenses. We've become experts at stretching every dollar, planning meals carefully, cutting out anything extra, and saying no to things we wish we could afford. Sometimes it's hard, and the weight of those tight months presses down on us when the car needs repairs or Jack outgrows his shoes faster than we expected. But we manage. Not because we have everything figured out, but because we face it together, with quiet determination, with patience, and with the kind of love that never asks for perfection. Jack doesn't notice the budget talks behind closed doors or the skipped date nights. What he sees is a home filled with warmth, laughter, and the knowledge that no matter what, he is surrounded by people who love him fiercely. And honestly, in a world full of uncertainty, that feels like more than enough. Despite the fact that Megan and I shared 50-50 custody of Jack, I continued to pay the same $600 in child support every month, without protest or renegotiation. On top of that, I covered an additional $200 for his health insurance, took on 60% of his school tuition, and paid for his clubs and extracurricular activities without question. It wasn't a legal obligation anymore, it was a choice. A deliberate one. Because to me, none of it was about fairness or keeping score. It was about Jack. It was about making sure that no matter where he was sleeping that night, he had what he needed to thrive. I wanted him to have the best. Not just a roof over his head and clothes on his back, but the kind of education, healthcare, and life experiences that would help shape him into someone confident, curious, and cared for. I knew Megan didn't always have the means to provide those extras on her own, and while our relationship had its share of hard edges, I never wanted Jack to feel the weight of financial strain between us. So I did what I could. I found room in our tight budget, sometimes cutting corners elsewhere, sometimes saying no to things Lauren and I might have wanted for ourselves because Jack came first. He always did. And the truth is, I never regretted it. Not once. Every time I watched him light up at science club or proudly show me a certificate from school, I knew I was investing in something bigger than money could measure. I was building a foundation for him, and no matter what it cost me, I'd do it again in a heartbeat. When I finally worked up the courage to ask Megan if we could reduce the child support to at least $250 a month, I did it carefully, gently, over coffee in a neutral public place because I wanted to avoid conflict. I explained everything, how my salary had dropped since I changed jobs to spend more time with Jack, how Lauren and I were doing everything we could to make ends meet, and how I was still covering insurance, most of his school tuition, and all of his clubs. I told her that I wasn't trying to avoid my responsibilities, that I just needed a little breathing room. But the moment the words left my mouth, I knew something had shifted in her. She didn't even respond at first, just stared at me with this stunned, burning look, like I had insulted her personally. Then, out of nowhere, she called me lazy, said I was trying to dump my fatherly duties onto her, and before I could even gather my thoughts, she stood up and threw a chair sideways, right there in the coffee shop. It wasn't just a scene, it was chaos. People turned to stare, staff came over, and I sat there stunned, not knowing whether to follow her or just disappear. She stormed out without another word. Later that night, she called me and her voice was sharp, full of cold fury. She threatened to sue for full custody, said she would take me to court if I ever dared to reduce the payments, and told me I should be grateful she hadn't done it already. It wasn't just anger, it was vengeance. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't about Jack anymore. It was about control. About old resentments and power, and the need to win some invisible battle I hadn't even known we were still fighting. I hung up the phone feeling hollow, like a father doing everything he could and still somehow always coming up short. After that conversation, Megan didn't just let it go, she twisted the situation in a way that left me reeling. Within days, her mother, who had always been polite if distant, started sending me a stream of angry, accusatory messages. One after another, my phone lit up with phrases like deadbeat, selfish, and unfit father, each more venomous than the last. It was as if every ounce of goodwill I had built over the years, every weekend spent with Jack, every quiet sacrifice I had made behind the scenes, had been erased with a single conversation Megan had retold in a version that painted me as the villain. I wasn't trying to run from my responsibilities. I wasn't trying to shortchange my son. I was just trying to make things fair, something balanced, something that made sense. We had 50-50 custody after all. We shared the days and the decisions. Jack lived in two homes that both loved him, and the financial burden of raising him was one that, logically, should be shared too. But instead of hearing that, Megan turned it into a narrative where I was trying to get out of paying, as if the hundreds I still provided for his insurance, his schooling, his clubs, and his everyday needs didn't count. I kept rereading the messages, stunned at how quickly everything I'd done was being drowned out by one request for a little relief. It wasn't about being cheap. It was about survival. About doing everything I could to show up for Jack in every way, not just the financial. But somehow, in trying to make things reasonable, I'd been cast as the enemy in a story I was still trying so hard to write with honesty. I agreed to mediation because, despite everything, the insults, the threats, the distorted stories, I still wanted to resolve things peacefully for Jack's sake more than anything else. I spent days gathering everything I could to make the case clear and factual. I printed out our shared custody schedules, detailed every dollar I had spent on his school, healthcare, and extracurricular activities, and attached receipts and bank statements. I even included a color-coded map of Jack's clubs and the routes I drove each week just to show how much of the logistics I handled. I didn't want to argue, I just wanted to be transparent. When the day came, I walked in prepared, holding a neatly organized folder that felt like the entire weight of my role as a father captured on paper. Megan showed up empty-handed. No documents, no receipts, not even a summary of her own costs. She came with only her frustration and the belief that she didn't need to prove anything. But numbers don't lie. When the mediator sat down and input everything into the custody and financial formula, there was a pause, an uncomfortable silence that stretched too long. And then the result came in. Based on our 50-50 arrangement and the actual distribution of expenses, Megan was supposed to be paying me $100 a month, not the other way around. She didn't say a word. She just stared as if the numbers themselves had betrayed her. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I just sat there quietly, finally feeling seen, not as the man she wanted to paint me as, but as the father who had been showing up all along. It wasn't about the $100. It was about the truth, and the moment it was finally acknowledged in front of someone neutral, I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in months. We signed a new agreement that day, one that finally reflected the reality we had been living for years but never officially acknowledged. It outlined everything clearly and without ambiguity: a formal 50-50 custody arrangement, a modest $200 monthly allowance to help cover Jack's expenses on the days he was with Megan, and a detailed division of holidays so that there would be no more last-minute arguments or emotional ambushes during the times that were supposed to be joyful for our son. I didn't ask for back pay, not a cent of the thousands I had contributed above and beyond what any court would have required. I could have. I had the paperwork, the proof, the moral ground to stand on. But I didn't want revenge or reimbursement. I just wanted fairness. I wanted peace. I wanted to know that moving forward, things would be clear and balanced, not for me but for Jack. I wanted to be able to look him in the eyes as he grew up and know that I had never used him as a pawn, that I had never tried to punish his mother through the system, and that every choice I made was to protect his world, not to shake it further. In the end, that was all I ever wanted: justice, stability, and the quiet knowledge that I had done the right thing even when it was hard. Since we signed the new agreement, Megan hasn't spoken to me directly, not a call, not a casual word, only brief, formal messages about pickup times or school events, typed with clinical precision and no trace of warmth. At first, I'll admit it bothered me, that cold silence, the unspoken tension still humming between us like unfinished business. But over time I realized it didn't matter. Because the main thing, the only thing that truly mattered, was that Jack was happy. He was growing up surrounded by stability and love, completely unaware of the quiet battles that had taken place behind the scenes. We had shielded him from the conflict, and for that I'm deeply grateful. He laughs freely. He talks about his two homes like it's the most natural thing in the world. He's excited about life, about school, about dinosaurs and soccer and everything in between. And this summer we're planning our very first family trip, just me, Lauren, and Jack. A few days at the lake, maybe a small cabin, nothing extravagant but something that belongs to us. Something that's only about joy and memories, not courtrooms or paperwork. And you know what? I'm proud. Not in a boastful way, but in the quiet, steady kind of pride that comes from surviving the hard parts and doing what needed to be done even when it wasn't easy. I look at the father I used to be, exhausted, disconnected, just trying to keep up, and then I look at the man I am now and I know I've grown. I've learned how to show up, how to listen, how to lead with love even when everything felt stacked against me. Jack made me a father, but the journey made me the kind of father I always hoped I could be.